We spent much of this course looking at the diversity of life. Let's look at the diversity of life in a community. Be able to define biodiversity, species richness, relative abundance, biomass, invasive species, trophic structure, food web, foundation species, keystone species, ecosystem engineer, and bottom-up and top-down models. Calculate the Shannon-Wiener Biodiversity Index for a community. Relate biodiversity to resource partitioning, and relate trophic structure to energy flow and productivity. Biodiversity is the amount of species in an area. Basically, what is the diversity of life in a given region? You can see this Chaparral Desert area has relatively low biodiversity. You can see a single species of shrub and maybe one or two species of moss, whereas it is much more obvious that there is a wide biodiversity in this adjacent desert environment that has wildflowers and different types of cacti. But how do we measure biodiversity? Well, we cannot just count all of the different species, because that just gives us a number of species, of course. There could be problems with attempting to count all the species, such as some are only there for certain seasons, or some are only there at certain times of the day. So you would have to have a lot of work done in order to have any potential guess at how many actual species there are. So there are species that are existing as spores and seeds as well, that you can't just grab a spore out of the air and say, ah, behold, a fern. There are also cryptic species where we might not be able to know the difference between two different species, even though they operate in very similar niches. And of course, rare species are hard to get, and any real count of all the different species in a region is likely to give at least one new potential species if that region is not well explored. And species richness doesn't really tell us about the health of a community. That would require something called evenness. While species richness is the number of species, relative abundance is the proportion represented by each species. You can get a community that has almost all of one species and a few of different species. Here we have in community A, all of one species, and then there are 4 individuals, each of a different species. Total is 5 species, but it's not a very even community. A high species evenness can exist in community B, where the same 5 species, but in equal proportions. These two communities would not have the same level of functionality. So let's look at how we would measure both species richness and evenness in a single metric, and that is called the Shannon-Wiener Biodiversity Index. What you need to do is you need to get the proportion of each species, and that here is given as P sub I. Then you take the natural log of each one of those proportions, given here as ln, natural log, P sub I, the natural log of the proportion of each species. You multiply both of these together, the proportion to the natural log of proportion, and then you would add up these numbers for all individual species. So every species from I equals 1 to S, wherever S is, and that is going to be your Shannon Diversity Index, well, when you multiply it by -1. This allows very rare species to still have a relatively large impact on biodiversity. For the Shannon Diversity Index, the minimum value is 0, and larger values mean more diversity. So why do communities vary in biodiversity? Well, let's look at some causes of biodiversity. There is, of course, competition. Competitive exclusion can remove certain species from an area, and niche partitioning, if there's a large enough niche, can allow species to exist while in moderate competition, but still exist in a survivable, viable population. This is also determined by the abiotic factors, such as available niches and available resources. So rainfall and temperature have a huge impact on biodiversity. If there's not enough water to go around, there will not be enough plants to go around, and thus the trophic levels at the base will fall and the trophic levels at the top can't exist. Also, niches are going to require that other species are present. You can see in this grassland there are no epiphytes. Epiphytes are plants that live on top of other plants. This is because there are no trees in this grassland. Why are there no trees? Well, that has to do with the seasonality and the prevalence of fire that destroys trees, but does not destroy the roots of all of these wonderful grassland species. A higher biodiversity can also mean a very much larger biomass per kilograms of living material. Since each species only uses a subset of the available resources, this is called resource partitioning, you're going to have each subset of resources used more efficiently when there are more species present, as was found in this wonderful grassland experiment. Some organisms are, of course, mutualistic and require the presence of one species in order to exist. This is why I often say that biodiversity builds more biodiversity. And of course, some organisms are commensalists. As I mentioned earlier, the epiphytes are commensalists, but they will not exist unless there are trees present to live on. Invasive species can cause problems for biodiversity. An invasive species is an organism established outside of its native range. They often overwhelm ecosystems because often they have no natural enemies and they can outcompete other species, allowing them to take up their full niche and push others out. It's easier for an invasive species to invade a disturbed or low diversity ecosystem because there is open space for them in a niche. A very biodiverse ecosystem is much more difficult for an invasive species to invade, which is why part of resilience is having more biodiversity to prevent invasive species from coming in and destroying an ecosystem. One way of looking at the different trophic levels is to look at the community structure in terms of a food web. So in here we can see a food web and a food chain. With your food chain, you have a plant, an herbivore, a carnivore, another carnivore, and another carnivore, with your as primary producer, primary consumer, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary consumer. But in reality, it's more of a web than it is a single chain, where the phytoplankton could feed either krill or copepods. The krill could feed either crab-eater seals or baleen whales. And the krill could also feed birds or carnivorous plankton. Birds could also just eat the carnivorous plankton, and birds could be eaten by smaller toothed whales, and you can see that there is a wide array of different eating patterns that could exist. I love how this one just says fishes, because there are many different species of fishes. See previous lectures. Trophic cascades are when you're going to have a trophic structure determined by the presence or absence of a boom in one of those species. So top-down regulation would be if I were to add more piscivores, which are fish that feed on fish, then those are going to feed on the planktivorous fish, which will feed on the zooplankton and then the phytoplankton. So what happens when I add more bass? Well, you get a lower number of planktivorous fish, a larger number of zooplankton, which means a lower number of phytoplankton. So if your lake is too green, add some bass. Kind of counterintuitive there, but it still works. Well, what if that's called top-down regulation, of course. And what if you added more to the bottom? Well, if you added more phytoplankton, then you're going to get more zooplankton, which means more fish, which means more fish. So these top-down and bottom-up effects have very different structures, where a top-down effect is minus, plus, or something like that, and a bottom-up is just plus, 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 plus. This is why increasing the base of the pyramid makes the whole pyramid larger. Trophic manipulation is done in some experiments. As I just mentioned, the bottom-up type is going to increase all levels above primary productivity, and top-down effects are going to increase the higher trophic level and every other level below. A foundation species can increase biodiversity because it has a disproportionate impact on the ecosystem due to its biomass. Douglas fir is the foundation species of our local forests. There is much more Douglas fir than there is, well, any other plant. Grasslands in prairie biosystem are going to have the highest impact. Coral is a foundation species of your coral reefs. All of these are going to have a large impact because of their large biomass. Whereas a keystone species has a disproportionate despite low biomass. Sea stars are a keystone species because of the number of things they eat. And since they tend to eat the most dominant creatures, then those most dominant creatures will then have a lower competitive ability because they are being eaten by sea stars. And since they have a lower competitive ability, this frees up space for other species to take in more resources. So they'll have more of the other things if the Pisaster are eating the biggest things. Trirabda and micropallet beetles feed on goldenrod, which is a strong competitive species in northeast grasslands. Because they feed on this species, they allow more species to exist because they get rid of the strongest competitor. Ecosystem engineers has a disproportionate impact due to changing the abiotic and biotic factors. Beavers chop down trees and make dams and change the structure of a forest by adding a pond. And that changes the water flow, changes water oxygenation, and a whole bunch of other factors, including even the presence of leaf beetles on the side shoots on the cottonwood stumps. You can also look at termites or ants as ecosystem engineers.